Thank you for coming. We're really, really happy that you said yes to this. It's also really nice to have both of you. And we have a few things we would like to ask you about your book. Which year was it published in America? Was it last year?
2023.
2023. So we're just a couple of years behind.
Yeah.
But because it was very relevant, you had to speak about the pandemic and everything. So we would like to start off by talking a little bit about the polyvagal theory in itself. So many people know about the vagus nerve, but not everything about the polyvagal theory. For me, it was also a strange thing. What is this polyvagal? What is it? Why is it poly? The theory, why does it have that name? And could you just explain it maybe in some simple practical terms?
Sure. First of all, the vagus is a nerve. It doesn't have any intelligence to it. It's a nerve or wire that connects our internal organs to our brain. It's a bidirectional communication system. Think of it as a surveillance system as much as a regulator of the organs, but it's primarily surveillance. It's communicating what our body is experiencing to our more aware brain. Okay, that's the first part. So the vagus in itself, don't get caught up with it. Get caught up with how you regulate the organs or the organs' impact on the brain through the vagus. So the polyvagal theory, and in fact, when I coined the term, the original paper actually had a footnote which describes why the title is that. And the first one was to emphasize that the nerve is actually a conduit with many different wires in it. And so some of those wires go to the heart, some go to the gut, but most of the wires are going from the visceral organs to the brain. And that information had to be emphasized in the title or the name of the theory. And the second one was that the components of the vagus did not evolve at the same time. So they, in a sense, embedded in the understanding of the vagus is the evolutionary history of vertebrates. So all vertebrates have a vagus, but the vagus changes with evolution. So I want to get that into the theory. And not only is phylogeny or evolution critical, but part of it gets mirrored in our own embryology and our own development. So the system changes with development, especially from the preterm for a fetus to a newborn to a child. It develops and it changes in its ability to efficiently communicate and also help us regulate our biological state, our physiology. So that kind of like gets you started, gives you the ground rules. So it's a theory about the communication and regulation through that communication of the organs of our body and how that influences how we feel and how we think and how we react to the world.
Yeah. So, I think, let me kind of translate this into something a little bit more understandable and practical to people. Polyvagal theory is a couple things. One is, as he said, it's basically a model for the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is what controls everything in our body that we don't consciously control. So our heartbeat, it just kind of happens. You don't think about it, right? But it's not always fast. It's not always slow. Sometimes it's fast. Sometimes it's slow. Your autonomic nervous system is what controls that. And everything in your body basically is controlled in this way, where there's different modes, different settings, different speeds, different rhythms that come into play in different times. And what polyvagal theory is, it's a model for how our feelings, if we feel stressed, if we feel relaxed, if we feel threatened, if we feel traumatized, how these shift, how basically everything in our body operates. And that's what is on an anatomic level, but on a practical level, which I think is what is really most interesting to people, what it is it's a model for how, uh, what it basically says is that when we are safe, or when we feel safe rather, and only when we feel safe, is our body able to access the systems that are required to live a good life. And it is a model that links our feelings of safety with our capabilities of being happy, of being healthy, of being social, and saying that within all of us is this great, immense potential for all of these wonderful things. But when we feel safe, and only when we feel safe, are we actually able to access those things. Because when we feel threatened, our body's entire orientation is shifted towards dealing with that threat. And in doing so, the systems that are required for health, for happiness, for growth, for restoration, for sociality, they're basically turned off. They're de-resourced. And that is why I think polyvagal theory is of such interest to people, because it explains why, when we don't feel good, our health suffers. It explains this relationship between our body's basic functions and how we feel.
Exactly. So in a way, it allows us to be our most fully human when we're in a safe
Yes.
condition. But what is it? So this is something that came up in discussions with other people. So what does it mean to feel safe, and from a physiological perspective, and why is it so important?
Okay, let's think of the concept of feeling safe as something that is emergent from our body. It's a feeling. It's part of our body. And let's basically build on what Seth was talking about. Uh, we're basically getting permission from our visceral organs to our brain. That information is giving us permission to feel safe. That if the signal is that our hearts are beating fast, our muscles are contracting, uh, the signal coming from our organs back up basically disqualifies the ability to feel safe. So it's not a conscious intentionality. It's a physiological state that gives us permission to feel safe. So this becomes extremely important how we relate to each other. We might say, "Are you scared?" And "You shouldn't be scared," might be our response, assuming that being scared and feeling safe are intentional behaviors when they're not. So the issue is, if I'm scared, what does my body need? It needs signals to tell my physiology that it's in a safe context. And that's what a mother's voice does to a crying baby. A father's voice may do the opposite. The father may become very irritable with the baby crying. And I would say with a toddler, let's get a little older, and where a father might be more irritated, while a mother will be just a good mother, a good father would be more welcoming and accepting of the behavioral state, recognizing that the behaviors are emergent from a physiological state of defense. So a signal of safety, a calming signal, enables the body to be more interactive, more co-regulatory, and to feel safe. So the real point I'm trying to make is that safety or feeling safe is not an intentional act. It's a response to signals in our environment or signals from others whom we feel safe with.
And crucial to this is the fact that oftentimes the things that people from a narrative or societal or system perspective say are there to keep us safe perversely make us feel unsafe. So imagine you're like a kid going to school and you walk through a bunch of metal detectors and there's security guards with guns. The story behind that is it's there to keep you safe. But what does it do to the nervous system? It makes the nervous system feel unsafe. And what polyvagal theory emphasizes is the difference between what actually makes us safe. It's saying that there's basically no relationship, but between what actually makes us safe and what makes us feel safe. These are two different things. And what polyvagal theory forces us to do is to pay attention to the cues, what these things do to our nervous system, how environments and behaviors actually make us feel, recognizing that this has a real impact on our body.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
If we
Sorry.
I was going to say, if we build on that, we say that if we live in an environment where social media and the news are saying no one's safe, and they're listening to this, their bodies start to process that they're not safe. And that interferes with that ability to feel safe with others, to be trusting, to literally calm others. And it basically builds on each other to create a fear-based society in which our bodies become locked into states of defense. And I think we're experiencing parts of that now.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and when we feel unsafe, a lot of things happen that, unfortunately, if one has cynical goals, can be exploited. When we feel unsafe, the parts of our body and brain that allow us to think critically, to learn new information, to be social, to connect, all of these things are turned off or much more difficult to access. So people might be, incentivized to make a large number of people, perhaps all of society, feel unsafe because they stop asking questions. If you look at history, how has every authoritarian, every fascist, every strongman in history operated? It's always the same playbook. Make people feel unsafe, because when you feel unsafe, you stop asking questions. All you want is somebody to come in and make you feel safe.
Exactly. And then with social media these days, you have the virality is connected to how unsafe it makes us feel. I see. It's more like
Yeah.
everything's
Oftentimes,
scary.
I
Mm,
mean, so the currency in social media is engagement. And the
mm,
things that keep us engaged, keep us staring at a screen, we all know the term doom scrolling,
mm,
are things that perversely make us feel unsafe. So if you're a social media company and your entire goal, you care about nothing else, is just to have somebody stare at their screen as long as possible, the algorithms, which learn what keeps us engaged and then gives up more of that, are
mm.
going to learn that frightening content is what works, and you're just going to get more and more and more of that.
Exactly. So now I'm wondering, the human cost of this chronic feeling of unsafety. What happens in our nervous system when we are exposed to prolonged stress or unsafety, at work or in schools or in society at large? What happens to us?
Well, I'll start with that. It's really quite simple. There's a retuning of our nervous system to change the threshold and shift priorities. The threshold is lowered to becoming defensive, and the priorities shift from trust, sharing, benevolence, compassion to protecting oneself. So if we basically make people, let's start with a simple one, make people financially insecure, they're going to start talking about what they need to feel safe enough.
Mm,
But if you now market that you can never be safe enough with stuff, you're basically creating a motivation to accumulate material without the next part of what it is to be a human, which is to connect, to trust, and to co-regulate. So we have shifted. And this is part of a culture that says you can never be, quote, safe enough, but they've translated it into say you can never have enough.
mm.
Because if you have enough, then you can reflect on the other attributes of what it is to be alive. But if you keep the motivation, it's like starvation in a metaphorical level.
Yeah, when we feel unsafe, our body only has a finite amount of resource,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And a lot of this is metabolic. When we evolved, calories were scarce, and our body had to make tough decisions about where those calories went. And so a big part of what the autonomic nervous system does is decide, where do the resources go? And when you feel safe, well, they can go towards systems of health, growth, restoration, sociality, and your brain just gets a lot more stuff too. You can think better, be creative, you can learn. But when you feel unsafe, again, priority is survival. And all of those other systems are de-resourced. And what happens then is, if you always feel unsafe, well, the systems are always de-resourced. Your body is chronically deprived of the resources to properly heal. Diseases, ailments, physical wounds hit us harder. Our brain is de-resourced. We don't think as well. We're less creative. We're less open-minded. We're less
mm.
able to learn. The systems required for sociality are de-resourced. We're less able to connect. We're less able to be social. Literally, the facial features, the vocal features that are required for like true social connection are disengaged. Basically, everything that makes life worth living is de-resourced, because what becomes the priority is survival. And so when we constantly feel this way, those systems are constantly de-resourced. And unfortunately, our health suffers in a very, very real way.
Let me build on many important points so that's bringing up. First, um, psychological stress and physical stress are interpreted by our nervous system as the same. So, threat that is psychological or threat that is really life-threatening is still creating the same physiological signature in our body. So, our body is sensitive to, let's say, physical and mental signals. And those signatures tell our body to get into a state of defense or to be accessible. And that is, I would say, the most potent word here, to become accessible to others. And if the culture says you can't trust others, then your ability to become accessible is limited, and you then miss the opportunities of the healing properties of trust and co-regulation. And we have to step back for a moment and think about the brilliance of what it is to be a human, and it's basically within a class of social mammals. And that is humans basically have the mechanisms to connect with others, to trust, and to co-regulate and literally heal each other to create the physiological state that promotes health, growth, and restoration through trusting interactions, through mutual signaling. The tragedy that I see is that the world is teaching humanity to behave in a chronically defensive mode and literally is not giving the physiology permission to allow the expression of co-regulation, trust, compassion, benevolence.
Yeah, and I think that really forces you to look at things differently because then you begin to say, all right, if systems or individuals or political parties, whoever it is out there constantly trying to make us feel unsafe, they're basically depriving us of our birthright as humans,
Yeah.
of our ability to live the best possible life. And recognizing perhaps that if the systems we rely on aren't going to facilitate feelings of safety, we need to make that space for ourselves in some way.
So, Seth, I like to use the term our biological mandate or evolutionary mandate. Our evolutionary mandate is to connect with others to feel safe, safe enough to be connected. And again, our culture gets in the way of that. It starts labeling immigrants as if they're threats, labeling people of different religions or skin color as if they're threats. So it's chronically uh, switching the physiological state from accessibility to self-protection.
Yeah.
Exactly. I was thinking about what you wrote. I mean, we'll get into this concept of co-regulation because I think we should go just to explain more about that. And I'm thinking that many people, if you look at social media, you think you're now bombarded with the vagus nerve stimulation apparatus of different kinds. But you talk about like the easiest way to stabilize our vagus nerve or stimulate it is through co-regulation. Is that right?
Well, not just the easiest, the most effective way, the
It is
natural.
co-regulation. Maybe you can
Yeah,
start with
yeah.
yeah.
So I think let's start from this idea that like a lot of us are dealing with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of feelings of threat. The next emergent question is, well, what do you do about that, right? Like, how do you make yourself feel better? And the best answer is this concept of co-regulation. And co-regulation is this thing basically baked into mammals where when our defenses are turned off and we're next to in an intimate position another mammal whose defenses are turned off, it kind of creates a positive feedback loop that allows both the participants in this co-regulatory behavior to further disengage their systems of threat and further feel safe and further access the systems required for healing. So if you ever laid and cuddled with a partner or with a dog or with a cat and you feel safe, you feel warm, you feel all of these things. What's happening is your bodies are signaling to each other that you're in a state of safety, and it kind of bounces back and forth because the number one cue that our nervous systems look for in deciding whether or not they can feel safe as opposed to threatened is what are the nervous systems of the people around us feeling? What are they doing? When we're around people, other people are a signal fire that tell us if they're anxious, if they're stressed out, well, that rubs off onto us. But if you yourself are relaxed and you're with somebody else who's relaxed, it becomes a positive feedback loop that allows both nervous systems to turn off the systems of threat, access these healing systems. And key to that healing system is oxytocin, which is sort of, the molecule involved with love, involved with pair bonding, but it's also a molecule deeply, deeply, deeply involved with the body's immune system, healing systems, defense systems. And when you co-regulate, you allow for this burst of oxytocin that is very, very powerful in its ability to heal us. And so co-regulation is, this process by which, whether with a person or with a dog or whatever it is, you're in a state of safety that is bouncing back and forth between the two, turning off the defense systems and accessing the healing systems.
Let me build on that for a moment. So, oxytocin is really part of a dorsal vagal immobilization without fear response. So, it's the whole idea that can our bodies not move and feel safe? and as opposed to not moving and freezing because we're in deep fear. And if we think about it, what it really means is I can be held in the arms of another and feel comfortable in that position, or I can give birth without a set of fear. I wanted to kind of give you a visualization. We have a cat. It's a 20-pound, so what's that, 8 kilo pat? It's a very large cat. And cats, domestic cats are really they're the model for the perfect, let's say, hunter predator killing machine. So we know that cats have basically instinctive and they have certain physiological characteristics that make them into good predators. But our cat lies on her back with her arms out to be rubbed on her belly, to be the most vulnerable part of any mammal. She wants to be massaged and she wants to be near us. So I started seeing that this animal that evolved to be a predator has so much, let's use the term love and connection to give that we can't use an excuse saying that I just don't, I can't do it. I'm a human. But humans are not, in a sense, the same level of predator that a cat is. And certainly we should be able to feel safe enough to be held in the arms of another. And this is the actually an interesting personal journey for me, because as I start to talk about polyvagal theory, the world of the trauma community where people had been abused, started to explain to me how their experiences fit the theory. And that is, if they could not feel safe enough to be held in the arms of another. Not that they didn't want to. They had great intentionality to be safe and to find that person that they would feel safe enough to be with. But their bodies reacted to that. And this became this interesting journey for me as a scientist to try to understand how does that imprint of feeling safe, how does it get established? And how does the imprint for trauma get so locked into a nervous system that it no longer has the capacity to be accessible? And that's where the neurochemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin are part of the signature that go with the autonomic signature. So literally, we get an autonomic response to life threat. It's a signature, and then it can either become hardened with vasopressin or softened with oxytocin.
Exactly. You speak about red zones, yellow zones, and green zones in your book, and also how play and dancing, how important that is for us in co-regulation. Those are two very should I say useful activities if you want to regulate your nervous system. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll do this here. So, the autonomic nervous system, it basically is this autopilot for our entire body that operates all of these systems that we don't consciously control, our heart, our breathing, our sweat, everything like that. But that autopilot doesn't always operate the same way. It basically has different, software profiles. So we're going to kind of run with this metaphor here. When you feel safe, it needs to operate one way. When you feel threatened, it needs to operate another. And while there's some nuance there, we kind of break this down into three basic states, basic autopilot programs that our nervous system or autonomic nervous system runs on. But the key variable being how safe does your nervous system judge it to be? And depending on the answer to that question, different systems are engaged, different systems are disengaged. Your whole body, your sensory experience, the way you feel shifts. And so, in broad strokes, we kind of break it down into three basic states using a traffic light as a metaphor: green, yellow, red. So when you feel safe, the green system, parasympathetic nervous system, is activated. And this is our system of rest, relaxation, of sociality, of all the good stuff, right? When you feel threatened, the yellow system, this is the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system is activated. This is our defensive systems, our activation, our mobilization systems. And when you feel so threatened that perhaps life threat is what's at stake here, when your body basically thinks it might die, well, that's the red state. And this is the freezing system, the immobility, the disassociation system. And this is really key to understanding trauma in many ways and people's response to traumatic events. Because until, somewhat recently, most people weren't aware that freezing was a valid and common response to duress and to threat. And so narratives would be built where if somebody shut down rather than fighting back in a state of duress, that they weren't actually attacked, as an example. And what polyvagal theory, through, basically this model of these three basic systems, forces us to do is realize that shutdown, freeze, and dissociation are common, valid, and normal responses to situations of deep duress. And when you begin to look at these systems, they give us these broad strokes ways of understanding what different feelings, whether we feel safe, threatened, or life threatened, what happens to our body, what happens to our senses, what are the shifts that are occurring under the hood, depending on how we feel.
Exactly. And you because I remember part of your discussion is about the justice system in the U.S. and, for instance, let's say rape victims. That one thing you wish the jury members understood was how the nervous system functions.
Yeah, I think not just that, but I think any sort of traumatic instance, I think it's required, I think we have this bias towards thinking that people's reactions are intentional and driven by consciousness. And so people might say, oh, there's a gun to your face. Why don't you fight back? Why don't you run? Not recognizing that it's not a conscious decision. It's the nervous system taking over and causing the freeze and causing the shutdown. And so we have this bias, I think, towards judging other people and their responses to things and whether or not a response is valid or appropriate based on what we imagine we would do had we conscious control of that scenario, not recognizing that when the nervous system takes over in these scenarios, it's oftentimes not up to conscious control.
So a rape victim, for instance, who doesn't fight back, could be that person is just frozen.
Yeah. Exactly.
Highly likely, and that becomes a real issue. Or we actually have written a paper on appeasement, and that is where people literally look like they're kind of cooperating with their predator, not realizing that that is really, if you to in a sense engage on a social level with under life threat, is a super talent or super skill that is predicated on a physiology that doesn't shut down under life threat. We misunderstand the features of what that person is actually doing on a neurophysiological level. And we start superimposing this concept, the simple one, intentionality. And that has, that there's a term called the Stockholm syndrome, which basically implies that the victim, the survivor, is basically in love or cooperating with the predator, when in reality, the survivor is navigating in a life-threatening situation with the skill set that an individual has at that point in time, meaning that not everyone has the resources to appease. They may shut down and they may be murdered because they lose, they're no longer interesting, they're no longer interactive. And so we have to have a different appreciation of how people react under life threat. And that's what the theory starts giving us, is a more nuanced view. I do want to go back because you asked a question about dance movement. And Seth very articulately described the different stages or zones, but we have some hybrid zones. And the hybrid zones are really interesting because they incorporate movement with socialization. Like, how do we know when a person is playing or running while playing or running in fear? And the answer becomes very evident in terms of looking at their faces. So when children are running and they're smiling, they're playing. But if children are running without a smile, our interpretation is something's chasing them that's dangerous. So we realize that if our our face works our social engagement system, which is part of the polyvagal theory, which links the face to the vagal regulation of the heart. If that's working, then we can move and we smile, and our signals of movement are not interpreted as threat signals. So dance movement therapies are very effective with people who have trauma histories, who, if you ask them to sit down during therapy, that immobilization creates a greater vulnerability. But if they're dancing and moving, they already have the sympathetic nervous system on board for movement, so they can't shut down.
Yeah.
It's really such an intuitive first step for a treatment of life threat trauma.
Yeah, and what I remember from the book is that you talk about how this both playing and dancing is a way of training the nervous system to glide between the different zones and not
Yeah.
get stuck in one. So you're able to go up to the red and back down to yellow and
Yeah.
then to green. And
Yeah, we have to think of dance, movement, and play as neural exercises and not think of them as optional experiences, but almost obligatory in getting our nervous system retuned.
yeah, exactly. I'm thinking about one of our, you probably heard about, we had a mass murderer here in Norway
Yes,
who killed a lot
yes.
of people, and he had a very disturbing childhood story. One of them was his lack of play. I mean, he wasn't interested in playing, and so I think that is a common aspect of several mass murderers' personality, what I've
Mm.
read.
Well, the ability to kill another
Yeah.
uh, uh, spontaneously, or I wouldn't say it's not even spontaneously, without care, without concern,
Mm.
um, it separates them from other people immediately. So the concept of co-regulation is going to be linked to a concept that we would call empathy,
Yeah.
the ability to feel someone else's feelings. The issue is you shouldn't be, see, I like to separate the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is feeling someone else's pain, and that means you're basically feeling their hurt. But compassion is you feel their hurt, you acknowledge it, you literally get over those feelings, and now you are there to be accessible and supportive to the other. So it's like I react to your feelings, I honor them, and now I'm here and I can help you.
Exactly.
As opposed to I feel your pain.
Hmm.
And when you walk into the world of trauma, the trauma community, you learn one thing almost immediately, that survivors of trauma are cautious about sharing their history because they are really averse to seeing the reaction in others when they tell their story. They don't want to see that empathic pain. They want, in a sense, someone to say, I'm here for you, not to say, oh, that must have been so horrible. That's not what they need. They don't need the acknowledgement of the horror. They need an acknowledgement that someone is there to support them in a transition out.
Exactly. Exactly.
And actually, we're going to step into one other contemporary, and that is the story of the women who were abused by Epstein.
Yeah.
The community as a whole, the abused or the survivors of Epstein, wanted their voice. They wanted to be heard. A lot of people felt initially that they wanted retribution or they wanted compensation, but they wanted their voice. That was the most important thing. They wanted to be heard.
Yeah, because they went to the police, and then very often they were not taken seriously, or
That's
their
right.
statements
The
were.
concept of power differential, the history of humanity, and where some people are literally above the law, is a very upsetting feeling
Yeah.
to actually, I say to many, many of us who try to think of society as having some basic rules of fair play,
Mhm.
justice.
Exactly. This is something that I'm thinking about now in this world where, yeah, for instance, in war-torn areas like, let's say, Ukraine or Gaza or anywhere, when you have you differentiate between external safety and subjective
Yeah.
experience of feeling safe. So, is it possible for people to feel safe even though they're in objectively tough or unpredictable situation, or even in a war
Yeah,
situation?
actually, let's step back because I actually had interactions immediately after the Gaza, uh, I would say the Hamas intrusion into Israel with Israeli therapists, and I've had several interactions with Ukrainian therapists during the Russian issue. Now, the one to me that is the most interesting is my interactions with the therapists in Israel. And this is early, a couple of weeks after the intrusion. And what I wanted to do was to talk about humanity and to get rid of labels, but I had misunderstood what had happened to the people in Israel, the actual therapists who wanted to be helpful, they were both angry and frightened. And their ability to be a therapist, to be accessible, to listen, to witness, to support, was greatly challenged by their own internal feelings, which was their shield of safety had been violated, permeated, penetrated, and they no longer felt safe in their own country. And therefore, they were broadcasting their own fear and anger when they were conducting their therapeutic sessions. And this is really your question. So I said to them, you cannot deliver therapy because you are broadcasting feelings or signals of safety, of threat and anger, and you cannot conduct therapy like that. You have to be present. So I said, your job is to feel safe enough with your colleagues uh, so that you can deal with your clients, which meant that you have to now structure the way that you live your life, meaning that you have to have enough experiences of co-regulation with your colleagues, go for walks, reduce your clinical load, and to basically say to yourself, I know I need to be helpful, but I have to be in the right state to deliver effective therapy. Now, when I talked in the Ukraine, it was a different issue. It was a very interesting, I would say, setting conditions. One time when I talked, they came out of the bomb shelter for the podcast, for the lecture. And I asked them, what were you doing in the bomb shelter? And they said to me, we were singing. I said, what were you singing? They said, patriotic songs. And then I used that to explain what they were really doing. They were co-regulating, they were vocalizing, they were doing neural exercises to create a community of sense of safety and co-regulation.
So that's one way to, so like, let's say a regular population, it's probably similar to what normal people would do, and perhaps in Ukraine they would dance or sing or
Yeah.
get together in some way or another.
Yeah, but to me, it was so touching because you could see that their faces, they were smiling under this duress. They were engaging, they were building their own resources to
Yeah.
be helpful to others.
Yeah, exactly. So,
And let me also say, they were not ruminating
no.
on, let's say, hatred to the Soviets or the Russians.
Yeah.
They were not focusing on that. They were focusing on regulating their friends, family, and colleagues.
Mhm.
And this was different than when I was discussing this initially with the Israeli therapists. They were still locked into states of fear and anger.
Mhm. Exactly. So it was quite two different situations.
Yeah, and I had to learn from those situations,
Mhm.
because the issue was I had to see that the physiological states of the different groups I was talking to weren't following the same rules. So I had to be sensitive to that the therapists in Israel were really, in a sense, survivors of a trauma at that moment.
Mhm.
And I had to be understanding and calmer and not give them directives in the same way.
Mhm.
But the ones in Ukraine were very prepared to be helpful to others at that point.
Mhm. A very good point. I'm thinking you have many chapters towards the end of the book about how to design societies, or at least prison systems, schools, health systems, to optimize our functioning and our nervous system function. So, could you talk a little bit about how we best could to design schools and workplaces
Yeah.
to optimize our human potential?
Well, first let's talk about why this is important. A lot of institutions out there have a stated goal. At schools, it's to learn, right? At workplaces, it's to be productive, maybe creative, depending on what your job is. At prisons, depending on where you are, it's perhaps rehabilitation. And all of these are functions or goals that are supported by people being in an autonomic state of safety. When we feel safe, we're better able to learn. We're better able to socialize, which is, of course, a secondary goal of schools. We're better able to be productive and creative, which is, of course, a goal of many professional workplaces. And so then it becomes very logical to think that, well, these institutions, as well as the people involved with them, would all benefit from people feeling safe. And then you begin to realize that oftentimes these institutions, whether it's the systems they operate in or the very architecture and aesthetics of the buildings that they exist in, are oftentimes not designed to make people feel safe. And then it becomes sort of a very simple logic where you can think to yourself, well, all right, well, what can we do to make people feel safe from an architecture and design and layout perspective? Things like lighting, things like the auditory environment, low frequency acoustical hums of office equipment, for example, might be processed as predator sounds. When you look at schools, recognizing that when people are socially engaged in small group settings, well, that activates the social nervous system, which is highly linked to our ability to feel safe, And so you start looking at these things in almost every step of the way, from a human level to a design level to an architecture level, and you can find little things you can do to make people feel safe and then recognize there are real benefits for just about everybody involved were you to actually prioritize these things.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. No, and we spoke a little bit before the interview about the difference. I mean, when I translated the last chapters, I told Stephen that in Norway we already have some understanding of how to design the prison systems best for rehabilitation. I think much more than in the US, or at least we have the willingness to implement a system where the prisoners feel safe and that they're actually being rehabilitated. But one aspect I think is hospitals. I don't think, I mean, in Norway, even now, we have people who live out, they stay out in the corridors instead of, because we don't have enough rooms, for instance.
Mhm.
So a patient who stays under this very strong lighting and with all the sounds that you
Yeah.
said,
Well, I mean, hospitals are such a clear place to think about this because hospitals are a place where you want people to heal, right? You don't just want people to heal, you want the environment to feel safe because we've all been, I think, I don't know, maybe in Norway, but in the US, I think we've all been through emergency rooms and had people who are out of control. They're screaming, they're causing fights, they're just spreading feelings of unease and anxiety and non-safety throughout the room. And when these feelings are spread in this environment, well, the people there, their nervous systems are not going to be in a state that's conducive to healing. Literally, the body will do better. The body will get out of that surgery better. The body's wounds will heal faster. The human staff, the nurses, the doctors who deal with immense stress in their jobs. I mean, can you imagine them? We've all seen TV shows like ER in the Pit. We know this is a stressful job. They're going to do better at their job if the environment is a little bit less stressful. Um, and so I think hospitals, because healing, which is so linked to our autonomic state, our physical capabilities of healing, you look at hospitals, there's such a clear correlation, such a clear need to think about felt safety in the environment.
Exactly. Exactly.
So actually, I'd like to discuss a brief point here, and that is
Yeah.
I'm working on technologies for educational and hospital or medical settings
Mm.
that provide acoustic environment or acoustic stimulation that calms the body, that would facilitate both learning and healing. So the issue is that we know that our body under states of defense interferes with health, growth, and restoration, but it also interferes with our ability to be creative and to be smart. And I'm trying, in a sense, a reverse engineering model. And that is, can we present the signals that tell our body to give up its defenses?
Yeah, exactly.
I would basically say the model I'm working on now is basically for chemotherapy. A treatment, of course, that has adverse effects, but basically saying to the body, be accessible. It's for your own good, and seeing how that works.
Okay. So could you explain a little bit how that would be done, or how
Yeah, well, it's okay. It goes back actually a few decades, and that was to signal to the body that safety was available, and that was like the maternal voice, the mother's voice, and that became a acoustic intervention known as the Safe and Sound Protocol, and that's actually there are over I think 4,000 providers of that technology now, and a couple 100,000 people have been treated with it. And so it uses modulations. It's a neural exercise of literally the intonation of voice. This new work that I'm working on is called Sonacia, and it's been created with a colleague who's a musician, a composer, and a digital wizard, I would say. His name is Anthony Gorey. And the idea is, can we embed in music, literally think of a soundscape, the endogenous bodily rhythms? So can we signal our body through these slow rhythms, like floating on a wave or slow rocking? Can we embed that into acoustic stimulation, soundscapes? And what does the body do? And what we found out was just listening to 15 minutes of it gave a significant release in oxytocin in about 80% of the people, and also in more like 90% of the people, they described the event or listening as peaceful and calming. And actually, that paper is now under review right now. But the notion is that you can trigger these calming physiological states that get our body back into a state that supports health, growth, and restoration. But let me flip back to a major problem in why this discussion is so relevant. We live in an environment in which we see things as cause and effect. So we think that everything needs to be treated external to the body, meaning that if you're sick, you need medicine, or you need surgery, or you need an intervention. And the issue is, when you incorporate polyvagal theory, you start realizing that the state, the physiological state of the individual, determines whether that intervention is going to be received or rejected. So you want the physiology to be welcoming and accessible. And that's why using that acoustic channel, which is our evolutionary heritage, to basically using music, using rhythms to calm our body, is the portal that is scalable and useful. In fact, we did a experiment, and the data are now in it, just on long COVID and listening to the music 15 minutes in the morning and at night, and comparing it with vagal nerve stimulator, a non-invasive one, twice a day as well. And the effects are similar. In a sense, they both showed improvements or reduction in the symptomatology of long COVID after a month of this.
Amazing. Amazing. Now that you come back over to COVID, I think that's a very fascinating aspect of your book, and how COVID affected our planet, or humans all over the world. But you were, of course, especially addressing America, and how it also might have affected the political situation. How did the pandemic, do you think, affect global politics, if I should say, and even American politics?
I'm going to let Seth start there.
I mean, okay, so it's a nice can of worms. The COVID, well, one of the things I think is very interesting about COVID is that it is a virus that spreads when we're near each other, physical proximity. Of course, our bodies require proximity and co-regulation to heal, which creates this paradox where in order to avoid this virus, we also compromise our body's natural ability to heal, because we're basically shutting off many avenues for co-regulation. This created an environment where a lot of people who were isolated did not have access to one of our body's primary ways in which it calms itself down, in which it heals itself, such things like co-regulation. And as a result, people get really angry. We kind of saw this. Emotions, we saw in real time what happens when people didn't have access to proper co-regulation. Emotions became very heated, became out of control. And I think that once anger like that and such emotions spread the way they did, I mean, that's going to have an enormous impact on just about everything, politics and everything else, because suddenly on a societal level, the parts of our body and brain that allow for critical, creative, independent thinking, as well as health, as well as growth and restoration, are basically being shut off on a large number of people. People become very reactionary, become very angry. They become just kind of pissed off. And I think a lot of what you see in a political level, not just in the US, but worldwide, since the pandemic, I think can be attributed to what happens when lots and lots and lots of people, their nervous system becomes tilted towards an alignment of threat and anger.
Mm.
Now, I wrote an editorial for a psychiatry journal on the paradox of what COVID did to our nervous system. So in general, the history of humanity is that when we're under threat, we interact with others.
Mm.
We co-regulate. We go to other people. We calm down. We share our experiences. When the pandemic occurred, the other person became a potential threat signal. So now our nervous systems were really in a strange way. I still remember walking down streets during the pandemic and people crossing the street not to cross a person on the same sidewalk. So in a sense, to avoid people.
Mm.
And our nervous system basically got into the habit of avoiding other.
Mm.
And we got retuned to start to treat people as if they were threats to our nervous system, to our health. And I realized this in myself, and I realized that I was becoming, quote, retuned because I was consciously avoiding people. I was no longer what I thought of myself as a social person. So I decided I'd go on a couple of speaking tours, literally. And the point was that my body, I had also aged in the period of time, but the travel was also exhausting. So rather than, quote, retuning and becoming more accessible, the travel resulted in exasperating the same symptomatology. So I've actually reduced my social behavior greatly over the past, it's now 6 years.
Right. And that seems to be a common pattern even among large parts of the population.
Let's stick with that for 1 second and start asking the question, how much are people working in proximity of others, or are they doing exactly what we're doing now, using Zoom or
Yeah,
some other form? And the answer is the workplace is no longer the social workplace.
that's right. No, remote work is more common now.
Yep.
Mhm. Yeah, we only have maybe 10 minutes left or something. I thought we had a very interesting pre-discussion before we started taping this, and that was about how America, because we're having a very unsettled global situation now. I mean, probably we always had, but especially for us in Europe now, it's a bit unsettling with what's happening in America and how we, for the first time, kind of feel America as a threat to our nervous systems and to us. And you said something very interesting about Americans and generational trauma. I thought it would be very interesting to hear more about America and the differences between Europe and America, since you are operating in
Well,
America.
I'll try.
Yeah.
And the issue is, again, I'm going to defer or place the roots of my conversation in the basically transgenerational history of the population of the US. So we are a transgenerationally traumatized society. We're people who left primarily Europe, many of them Europe, and now more from Asia and from South America, but left their country of family origin because the country of family origin was not safe. It wasn't merely economic. For many of them, it was survival. And this resulted in literally a trajectory of survival through accumulation. And so the model within the US was really that if you accumulate enough, meaning you have enough financial resources, you would be safe. And so you start seeing this great mobilization towards acquiring material objects. It's all metaphorically like large houses, big cars, spending money, and not in the sense of enriching the social community. And what we start to see is there's an imbalance of what was historically a concept of successful living versus what became a modern concept of successful living. And it was no longer creativity, music, poetry, arts, it was no longer this Renaissance concept of humanity. It was quite narrow in terms of amount of money. And even so, if I go back to what my parents told me, and my grandparents were the immigrants, the parents basically said you have to be a professional. You had to have, in a sense, you couldn't be a laborer, you had to be a professional. And you couldn't even just be in the trades. You had to be, doctor, lawyer, scientist, academic modeling. And that was because of their complex need state, which was not just accumulation, but accumulation with, I would say, conceptual wealth, not just material wealth. And I think that conceptual wealth has disappeared or disappearing in the US when it starts getting against books, against science, against knowledge, against creativity, and starts narrowing it in terms of a different pragmatic output. So I think for me, it's the easiest thing to see in terms of the political leaders of the country now and their ability to basically be very pragmatic in terms of what they think they will personally get versus the concept of generosity, benevolence, and compassion. I think that is this big shift that you may be sensing in the US because those of us in the US are sensing it because for our whole history, my own history as a human, it was about doing the right thing and, in a sense, being a good person, being a good citizen, caring for others. Now, there might have been some hypocrisy in it, meaning that if you were a certain religion or a certain skin color or a certain nationality, uh, the whole idea was that that inclusive envelope was expanding, and that's what the world I thought I was living in which it was expanding to be inclusive. And what you are experiencing is that inclusivity start to challenge those that did not have much, in a sense, resource. They were not safe in the life they were living, and their safety became in marginalizing others. And so I start seeing something that I had never experienced in my life, and that is a type of let's say, dismissiveness, a marginalization of people who are trying to do the good thing, do the right thing, whether it's scientists or whether it's politicians or teachers, or, it just hurts because when you grow up in even when I was in high school, they took a course that was called civics and was all about the underlying principles of what it was to be part of the American model of democracy. And to see basically the proclamations on TV recently of where the administration is going is such an affront to the traditions that we grew up with. So I'm just saying I'm in pain as well. And I am basically, I would say the optimism comes with an understanding that there are, in the US, there are at least 60% share my views. The sadness to me is that there's 40% that doesn't, and it doesn't make sense to me because if we all prosper, we all prosper. It's a no-brainer that being marginalizing people is not the strategy. So anyway, the patience that I will come back with, in a sense, the optimism, is that there are many people sharing these views. They may not be as vocal as the negative presentations, but they're there, and there are a lot of people who are literally working on, and I'll go flip it even into the trauma world, trying to solve the problems to enable people to rehabilitate, to recover, and to enable them to share compassion and humility and accessibility. And that's my journey is on that level, is that to understand those mechanisms, to, in a sense, open up humanity to its own self with the belief, and this is my belief system, that our nervous system is a loving, trusting, connected nervous system, and all we need to do is get it out of its defensive state.
Exactly. So what you're saying actually is that it it does in a way have political consequences, your worldview and what you've learned about the body. I
Yeah.
mean, what kind of politics are good for human beings?
Yeah. So in a simple word, I'm a founder of what we call the Polyvagal Institute.
Yeah.
And I would basically sum that as a community, a networking community. in which people feel safe enough to be who they are. And with that, it means their brilliance automatically comes out. And in fact, there are now 15 in 15, we have international partners in 15 different countries. So it is a community that understands this importance of a physiology that is in a state of threat versus a physiology that is welcoming and accessible to other. Because if it's welcoming and accessible to other, the emergent properties are generative. It's a problem-solving physiological system. It's not a protective, defensive one. And we are, in a sense, saying, feel safe if you can. These are, in a sense, the rules or the principles that will help you. And when you feel safe, the creativity will be there to solve the world's problems.
Exactly. Do you want to add anything, Seth?
No.
No?
Well,
Yeah.
so the one final comment is you understand why I wrote the book with Seth now.
Yeah.
Seth has.
I want to come back to this aspect between the two of you, the personal journey behind the book. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, I would basically say, Seth's a communicator. I have ideas, and I forget that sometimes my ideas are dense, complicated, and I need a person who has the ability to translate ideas into words that others can understand.
Yeah, pretty much.
So this was your job, huh?
Yeah. I had began to, as I got older, I began to recognize the importance of a lot of the ideas related to polyvagal theory and the value of them, and also how inaccessible they were to people. And, just by, I guess, dinner table osmosis growing up with him, I sort of had developed an understanding of the material, and I think importantly, how to explain it to people who aren't academics or scientists or therapists. And that was, the impetus for the book was how do we translate these ideas into something that anybody can understand and use.
How did writing the book affect you? Did it have did it have a great impact on you?
I mean, anytime you take on a big project like that, it's going to have a great impact with you. It was a joy to work on this with my father and to, help get these ideas out there to a different population, and straight from the source. I think without him kind of stepping up and participating in this project and helping to translate his own works, it would have been inevitable that others would have, and they would have either got things wrong or used it for their own ends, to sell something or something like that. And the goal here is simply, let's just get this out there in a way people can understand and use without those layers of middlemen and cynicism.
Has it affected your work in any way? Are you working more with these issues in any way?
Me or him? What are you asking?
You?
Sure, yeah. I mean, like I think once you really immerse yourself in polyvagal theory, you begin to see it as a lens through which you see everything. In the book, I kind of describe it as a worldview, as a way of experiencing seeing the world. And once you sort of see it and you sort of see things through the prism of the importance of safety and the importance of making yourself and other people feel safe, you see it everywhere. And both in professional and personal life, for sure.
Yeah. So in wrapping up, what are your plans now? Are you going to write more books, or what are your plans professionally?
Both of us? Are you asking here?
Yeah, both. Are you having this? Maybe you have some more common projects.
All right, Dad, what are you up to? Yeah.
Well, we are working on a common project, but it's more of an application. So I'm actually Seth and I are working on technology that brings polyvagal concepts into basically, I would say, social media.
Is this a secret, or can you say a little bit more?
It's up to Seth.
I don't even know what he's talking about. So sure, just let it linger as a mystery here.
We're working on ideas of how you can use platforms to communicate better. But the thing I would do want to say is that I didn't twist Seth's arm to translate or to write the book with me.
Oh, that was my idea. Yeah,
it was his idea, and I think that's the only way it would work with me. And that is the reflection that he asked me, and I was so thrilled. And I view it as the greatest gift that a son can give his dad is to help his ideas become understandable to others.
Wonderful. Yep. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I can't wait for to see what this new project or whatever happens with it. It will be really fascinating because social media is affecting us so much in any mostly negative ways, I believe. So yeah, keep us posted. We will talk with you again, I hope.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Very nice to meet you.
So nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Okay, so we're finished.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And please shoot us a message about your travels to if you're even thinking about traveling here or
Seth might. I'm not thinking of traveling at all.
I have to run, folks. Thank you very much for having us.
Listen, thanks, Seth. Talk to
Okay,
you soon.
bye. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Seth.
Bye.
Stephen,
Okay.
bye. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.